So today I'm going to be sharing some troubleshooting tips for some common problems when it comes to foundation paper piecing. So I always get questions on how do I fix this, or what about this, what do I do here? And I just want to make a video to help you overcome some of those challenges if you're facing them yourself. So to start, let's talk about one of the most common problems when it comes to foundation paper piecing, and it is getting your scale wrong when you are printing your patterns from your computer. So this is super important to have the scale right, because if it's off at all, then your seam allowances will be off and the size of your finished block will be off. So to make sure you are getting the scale correct, you want to have your printer settings at 100% and make sure that they do not default from that, because like I said, everything will be off. But an easy way to tell if it has printed correctly is by measuring the test block that is included in each of my patterns. It's just a 1-inch test block. Go ahead and measure that, and if it is on, then you are ready to go. The second problem I see often is the fabric that you have is not cut big enough for this section. So to make sure that you have a big enough piece, I recommend using a light source. So that can be a light board or a window, the light from your sewing machine, even your phone's flashlight, to make sure that it covers all sides of the section, giving it at least a 1/4 inch area all the way around it as well to be able to sew onto. So my tip for that is, when in doubt, go bigger. I know that sometimes you want to use up your small scraps, or you don't want to go as big for waste, but trust me, it's far more frustrating to be seam ripping it out when you don't cover that piece. So the other thing you can do is, if you cut too big, which is a great thing, then you can just trim and use the excess in other projects. I have this bin of scraps that are just small pieces specifically for my FPP blocks, and I just reach in there and get those. So I don't feel like I'm wasting fabric because I always use those scraps in other pieces. So another problem is you need to account for angles. So let me show you what I mean. When you have sharp angles, you need to make sure you are accounting for that sharp angle. And you can see that here. So this is a pretty sharp angle between E1 and E2. So let me show you what I like to do to make sure I've accounted for the angle. So we're gonna flip it over and lay our E1 piece, which is a background piece. And then I'm gonna put it about a 1/4 inch over that line. Now, I wanna show you, when you're lining up, if you line it up just at the, let me take this away to show you. If you line it up just at this little line right here, between E1 and E2, when you open it, you can see you're going to miss all of this area and often cut off that tip. So you want to make sure you're accounting for the angle. So I usually tend to give way more than I need and put it way up here, so that when it gets flipped over, there's plenty of space. So just make sure you keep that in mind. You're not just stitching for this little line right here, right there. You're stitching way past that to fold and cover everything. So I just like to go bigger and make sure that I'm not lining it up, right here. This is a pretty small piece, but if it were bigger, if I'm lining it up right there, it's not gonna cover. So just always account for the angle. Another problem that people have with foundation paper piecing is bulky seams. So one thing you can do for bulky seams is to tear out the paper beforehand, just along the seam allowance, so that you can keep that seam nice and pressed and flat. You can, if you are confident with your 1/4 inch seam allowance, then you can take those papers out and just sew it with your own 1/4 inch. But if you like to have that, if you like to sew on the solid black line to make sure you are lining them up correctly, then you can sew 2 pieces together and then take it off for the next piece. So to reduce seam bulk, pretend both of these pieces are finished and totally sewn on. When you go to sew both of these together, then what you can do after, well, it'll be more like this. What you can do after is tear out the paper just on the seam line and leave all of this, and that'll help reduce some seam bulk. The other thing that will help with bulky seams is to make sure you're using steam in your iron. And when you are ironing your foundation paper piece blocks, you want to make sure you're not just ironing it really hard all over, because that will cause your seams to stretch, and it could also warp your fabrics, because lots of the fabrics are cut on the bias because they're just scraps. So make sure when you're using your iron, you're just pressing it up and down. The other thing you could do, which is my favorite and preference, is to use a seam roller, and that doesn't bring any heat but gets the seams nice and flat. Another thing that people have troubles with is they don't like seeing their thread color, because sometimes when you press open your seams, the stitching will stretch and expose the thread color, which I don't really mind, but if you do mind, then make sure you're using a coordinating color with your fabrics, and then that won't even be an issue. Another thing is you never want to iron your FPP block on the back, on the paper side, because sometimes you can get ink transfer on your iron. Ask me how I know. And then if you go back and iron on the front, that ink can transfer to your fabrics. So yes, please don't ever iron on your paper side, just the fabric side. The other thing you want to do when foundation paper piecing is to iron between each step, or press between each step, because you want those seams nice and flat. You want everything smoothed out. And I know it's hard because you just want to jump into a project and keep going, keep sewing, but make sure you're pressing them between each one. That'll help with seam bulk, it'll help not warp the fabrics, and it'll help for an overall polished look. So those are some of the common problems I have personally with FPP, and I've heard you guys have too. So I hope these help you in troubleshooting and making foundation paper piecing a more enjoyable experience. But please, if you have more questions, let me know in the comments below, and I'd be happy to do a video on them. Thank you.